Hello, today we talk about the audio-lingual method. So it is an oral-based approach. However, it's very different in that rather than emphasizing vocabulary acquisition through the exposure to its use in situations, the audio-lingual method drills students in the use of grammatical sentence patterns. It also, unlike the direct method, has a strong theoretical base in linguistics and psychology. The outbreak of World War II heightens the need of Americans to become orally proficient in the languages of both their enemies. So the US military provided language courses that focused on the oral skills, the Army method. Charles Fries of the University of Michigan led the way in applying principles from structural linguistics in developing the method, and for this reason, it has sometimes been referred to as the Michigan method. Later, in its development, principles from behavior psychology by Skinner were incorporated. It was thought that the way to acquire the sentence patterns of the target language was through conditioning, helping learners to respond correctly to stimuli through the shaping and reinforcement. Learners could overcome the habits of their native language and form new habits required to be target language speakers. In order to come to an understanding of this method, let us now tell you about structural linguistics and Skinner's behaviorist theory. First is structural linguistics. It is an approach to linguistics which treats language as an interwoven structure, in which every item acquires identity and validity only in relation to other items in the system. All linguistics in the 20th century is structural in this sense, as opposed to much work in the 19th century, when it was common to trace the history of individual words. Leonard Bloomfield was the pioneer among structuralists, attempting to lay down a rigorous methodology for the analysis of any language. So let's compare structural linguistics and generative by Chomsky. So the first one is an approach to linguistics. Structural linguistics involves collecting a corpus of utterances and then applying discovery procedures to them in an attempt to classify all of the elements of the corpus at their different linguistics levels: the phonemes, morphemes, word classes, noun phrases, verb phrases, and sentence types. Alright, so various researchers continued to refine and experiment with the approach until the 60s, but from the late 50s onwards, the structural linguistics has sometimes been used because supporters of generative linguistics, for example, Noam Chomsky, have regarded the work of the American structuralists as too narrow in conception. They have argued that it's necessary to go beyond a description of the local items to produce a grammar which mirrors a native speaker's intuitive knowledge and language. Now we can talk about the behavior theory. So overall, to the behaviorist, the human being is an organism capable of a wide repertoire of behaviors. So this theory takes language acquisition as a process of habit formation through stimuli-response model, as represented in Skinner's verbal behavior. First is the child imitates the sounds and patterns which he hears from around him. Second one is people recognize the child's attempts as being similar to the adult models and reinforce. So the third one is, in order to obtain more of these rewards, the child repeats the sounds and patterns so that these become habits. In this way, the child's verbal behavior is conditioned until the habits coincide with the adult models. To apply this theory to a language learning is to identify, the first one is organism. It's the foreign language learner, so behavior, verbal behavior. The third one is a stimulus. as what is taught or presented of the foreign language, and the response, learner's reaction, and reinforcement. It's like an approval or praise. So reinforcement is a vital element in the learning process because it increases the likelihood that the behavior will occur again and eventually become a habit. So foreign language learning is basically a process of mechanical habit formation. So good habits are formed by giving correct responses rather than by making mistakes. Language skills are learned more effectively if the item to be learned in the target language are presented in spoken form before they are seen in written form. So the meanings that the words of the language have for the native speaker can be learned only in linguistic and cultural context, not in isolation. And now let's come back to the audio-lingual method. There are short-range and long-range objectives. Short-range objectives include training in listening comprehension, accurate pronunciation, recognition of speech symbols as a graphic signs on the printed page, and ability to reproduce these symbols in writing. So these immediate objectives imply three others. First is control of the structures or sounds, form and order in the new language. The second one is the knowledge of the vocabulary items that bring content to these structures. And the third is meaning in terms of the significance these verbal symbols have for those who speak the language natively. So long-range objectives must be language as the native speaker uses it. Here we can see the main principles of audio-lingual method. Language forms do not occur by themselves. They occur most naturally within a context. The native language and the target language have separate linguistic systems, so they should be kept apart so that the student's native language interferes as little as possible when the student attempts to acquire the target language. One of the language teacher's major roles is that of a model of the target language. Teachers should provide students with a good model. By listening to how it's supposed to sound, students should be able to model it. So language learning is a process of habit formation. The more often something is repeated, the stronger the habit and the greater the learning. It's important to prevent learners from making errors. Errors lead to the formation of bad habits. So when errors do occur, they should be immediately corrected by the teacher. And the purpose of language learning is to learn how to use the language to communicate. Particular parts of speech are in the slots in the sentences. So in order to create new sentences, students must learn which part of speech occupies which slot. Positive reinforcement helps the students to develop correct habits. And students should learn to respond to both verbal as well as non-verbal stimuli. Each language has a finite number of patterns. Pattern practice helps students to form habits, which enable the students to use the patterns. And also students should overlearn, so it means that learning to answer automatically without stopping to think. So the teacher should be like an orchestra leader, conducting, guiding, and controlling the students' behavior in the target language. And the major objective of language teaching should be for students to acquire these structural patterns. Students will learn vocabulary afterward. The learning of foreign language should be the same as the acquisition of the native language. We don't need to memorize rules in order to use our native language. So the rules necessary to use in the target language will be figured out or induced from examples. And the main challenge of foreign language teaching is getting students to overcome the habits of their native language. In comparison between the native and target language will tell the teacher in what areas your students will probably experience difficulty. And speech is more basic to language than the written form. The natural order, the order children follow when learning their native language or of skill acquisition, is like listening, then speaking, then reading, and then writing. So language cannot be separated from culture. Culture is not only literature and the arts, but also the everyday behavior of the people who use the target language. One of the teacher's responsibilities is to present information about the culture. Now let's move to the syllabus. Audiolinguism is a linguistic or structure-based approach to language teaching. So the starting points is a linguistic syllabus, which contains the key items of phonology, morphology, and syntax. So this may have been derived in part from a contrastive analysis of the difference between the native tongue and the target language, since these differences are thought to be the cause of the major difficulties the learner will encounter. In addition, a lexical syllabus of basic vocabulary items is also usually specified in advance. The language skills are taught in the order of listening, speaking, reading, and writing. So listening is viewed largely as training the oral discrimination of basic sound patterns. The language may be represented entirely orally at first. Written representations are usually from learners in early stages. So the learner's activities must at first be confined to the audio-lingual and gestural visual bands of the language behavior. Let's talk about the techniques. The first one is dialogue memorization. So dialogues or short conversations between two people are often used to begin a new lesson. Students memorize the dialogues through mime, and students usually take the role of the person in the dialogue and the teacher to the other. Next one is repetition drill. Students are asked to repeat the teacher's model as accurately, as quickly as possible. This drill is often used to teach the lines of the dialogue. Chain drill is the next one. It gets its name from the chain of conversation that forms around the room as students, one by one, ask and answer questions each other. Next one is single thought substitution drill. So the teacher says a line, usually from the dialogue. So next the teacher says a word or a phrase called the cue. So the students repeat the line to the teacher and substituting the cue into the line and its proper place. So the main purpose is to give the students practice in finding and filling the slots of the sentence. Next one is multiple slot substitution drill. It's like similar to the previous one. Next one is transformation drill. And the teacher gives students a certain kind of sentence pattern, an affirmative sentence, for example. So students are asked to transform the sentence into a negative one. And other examples of transformations to ask students are changing a statement into a question and or active sentence into a passive one, or direct speech to a reported one. Okay, next technique is question and answer drill. It gives students to practice with answering questions. They should answer the teacher's questions very quickly. Next technique is use of minimal pairs. So the teacher works with a pairs of words which offer in only one sound, for example, sheep. And students are first asked to perceive the difference between these two words, for example, sheep and sheep. So he selects the sounds to work. Okay, next one is complete the dialogue. Selected words are erased from a dialogue students have learned, and students complete the dialogue by filling the blanks with the missing words. Alright, let's talk about the advantages and disadvantages. Advantages are the fact that listening and speaking skills are emphasized in audio-lingual methods, and especially the former rigorously developed. So the use of visual aids is effective in vocabulary teaching. Next one is that the method is just as functional and easy to execute for language larger groups. And also the correct pronunciation and structure are emphasized and acquired. And disadvantages: the behaviorist approach to learning is now discredited, so many scholars have proven its weakness. Also, it does not pay sufficient attention to communicative competence. Only language form is considered while meaning is neglected. Equal importance is not given to all four skills. Also, the fact that it's the teacher-dominated method and it is a mechanical method, since it demands pattern practice, drilling, and memorization over functional learning and organic usage. And also, the learner is in a passive role. He has little control over the learning. And now let's talk about situational language teaching. It is a term not commonly used today, but it is an approach developed by British applied linguists in the 30s and 60s, and which had an impact on language courses, which survive in some and still being used today. It's by Richards and Rogers. It was in 1986. So the oral approach and situational language teaching relied on the structural view of language as audio-lingual method. So both speech and structure were seen to be the basis of language and especially speaking ability. Talking about its objectives, it's to teach a practical command of the four basic skills of language through structure. Also, accuracy in both pronunciation and grammar, its ability to respond quickly and accurately in speech situations, and automatic control of basic structures and sentence patterns. Talking about the syllabus, we can say that it uses structural syllabus and a word list, where the structures are always taught within sentences and vocabulary is chosen accordingly to how well it enables sentence patterns to be taught. Next is techniques. It implies a situational approach to presenting new sentence pattern and drill-based manner of practicing them. By situation means the use of concrete objects, pictures, realia, which together with actions, gestures, can be used to demonstrate the meanings of a new language items. So a typical situational language teaching lesson would start with stress and intonation practice. Then the main body of the lesson might consist of pronunciation revision. It's to prepare for the new work if necessary, and presentation of new structure or vocabulary, oral practice drilling, and reading of material on the new structure or written exercises. Okay, there are some advantages. It is suitable for introduction to the language and oral production without risk. It's an accessible method for teachers if they have a good curriculum. And also it does not require many resources. It is a good method if we use it in teaching pronunciation and vocabulary. And its strong emphasis on the oral practice, grammar, and sentence patterns conform to the intuitions of many practically oriented classroom teachers. And the advantages: the learner has no control over the content of learning. He is required simply to listen and repeat what the teacher says and to respond to the questions and comments. So this method do not account with the fundamental characteristics of language, namely the creativity and uniqueness of individual sentences. That is all for today. Also here you can see our references. Thank you for your attention. Goodbye.